In Focus discussion tonight. The relationship between crime and the media is a complex and complicated one. Some stories grab the public's attention for a little bit, but then fade away. Some stay in the news cycle for a long time, and some don't even get any coverage. Since the Gabby Petito case quickly rose and stayed in national headlines, our 7 p.m. team would like to pull back the curtain and discuss some of the factors that goes into this process. Kicking off our conversation tonight is our very own senior crime and punishment correspondent, Marcos Ortiz. And Marcos, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, you were in the thick of the Gabby Petito case. What was it about this case that made it so reportable?
Well, it had all the ingredients that you look for in a story. A young woman missing, they can't find her. Her boyfriend, perhaps, maybe involved. He can't be found. The parents also, Brian Laundrie's parents, not helping. It was just a big mystery, and I think that people could relate to that simply because, how would you like it if you as a parent, this was your daughter, or perhaps maybe this has happened to your son. This is, it's the old stereotypical question of like, it's a parent's worst nightmare, and that's what's happening here with the Gabby Petito case, and that's what I think everyone's got the interest in this.
How do you compare this case to some other big media cases like Chad and Lori Daybell, which is not only bigger in terms of the crime, but also seems to be a lot more dramatic?
Well, I think each of those cases that you've talked about there, Rosie, are basically equal in terms of appeal to the audience. Everyone can relate to a child, missing. Oh my gosh, what happens if that was my own child? So the horror that exists in something like that, that gets people's attention right away. The same thing with Gabby Petito. This is a young woman. What happens if that was a daughter? Both of those are just on equal level in terms of the impact and the community reaction. People are quite interested in those types of cases. Young people, young children missing.
Now, in your decades-long career, do you ever get surprised by what stories gain traction and stick around? Have you ever reported on a case that maybe didn't get as much reaction that you think should have?
Well, I think this week, for example, is one of those cases. I've been working on a 1985 cold case murder, and what I found in this case here was quite revealing. Rosie, there were documents that implicated a suspect, and police back in the 1980s had these documents. The prosecutor had these documents, yet nothing was done about it. Why? We don't know, but just in today's report today, we understand that police are now going to reinvestigate. They have now looking at this case. They call it an active investigation, and they're forwarding their findings to the Utah Cold Case Review Board in hopes that maybe something can happen. But it's really surprising that, this is not getting much traction because people just, I think people just don't look into these types of stories quite thoroughly. Everyone is looking at reports of today's media, today's event, today's murder, today's crime. No one's digging into the past about those old cases, and I think that's what we attempt to do here with the Justice Files.
Now, social scientists and media critics, they use this term missing white woman syndrome to point to a certain case that seems to get a lot of play in the media. What extent do you suppose race plays in these types of cases?
Well, I think our approach here at ABC4 is that everyone is important, and I, as a reporter, believe that all cases are important, but there's some perception, especially amongst minorities. The families feel like their case is not being looked at simply because they're a minority. I go back to the Rosie Tapia case, and Rosie Tapia, her mother, always felt that the media, there was very little attention in the case of her little girl going missing. Of course, her body was found the next day. But, you know, after 24, 48 hours, the case just disappeared. And she always but she always pointed out to the Elizabeth Smart case when Elizabeth went missing. There was a lot of fuss here in Salt Lake. The police, the media, they were all over this case for days, weeks, months. And Elaine Tapia just saw that and she says, how come this could not have happened to my daughter? So there's that perception out there. But, you know, there's reasons why some cases get more attention than others.
And social media has played a big role in the case of, let's say, Gabby Petito. So how do you see the dynamic between social and traditional media? Which pushes the other in cases of crime?
You know, when I first got in this business, I've done stints in radio, newspaper, and now television. But when I first got in this business, I always thought that radio had the advantage of breaking news stories out there because they could just get on the radio, get on the telephone and report what's going on in front of them. For television, it's a little bit difficult. For newspaper, you have to basically wait for the next day. But social media is today's radio. You instantly provide news coverage for the viewer by posting something with your cell phone at that moment. You're at a fire. There it is. You can just show your followers, here's the fire. It's on this street. And people are just glued to social media because that is today's medium right now. If you want more in-depth coverage, if you want more to know a little bit more about it, then you turn to your local news broadcast later in the day.
Such an interesting comparison. Marcos, we have about 30 seconds left. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you like to change about how crime is reported across the country?
I think it's our sensitivity towards the victims. I've always thought that you have to treat the victims with treat them very carefully, you know, and not put a microphone in their face as soon as you've learned that, you know, they've just lost a child, they've just lost their husband. You know, that's the most insensitive thing that I see the media sometimes doing, and I wish we could kind of step back and not do that. But, you know, everyone wants to be first.
Right. We really have to think about that line between being a journalist and being a human. You've been hearing from Marcos Ortiz, ABC4 Senior Crime and Punishment Correspondent. Marcos, thank you so much for sharing your insight, experience, and knowledge with us tonight.
The pleasure was mine.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to our In Focus discussion tonight on crime and the media. Up next in our conversation, live via Zoom, is Chris Burbank, Vice President of Law Enforcement Strategy for the Center for Policing Equity. Chris, it's always great to see you. Welcome back to the show. We'd like to pick your brain here a little bit, get some candid thoughts from you. How do police typically view the media? What is the relationship like?
Well, so that's an interesting question because I think there's a lot in the policing profession that view the media as the watchdog that's trying to catch them. I, however, have a little bit different spin. I always viewed the media as my best conduit to the public. And I'll tell you, it's very hard for anyone in the media to play the gotcha game with you if you just stand up and tell the truth and you're the one reporting it. You don't wait till after the fact that someone finds out and then asks you the question. You go and say, especially when you make a mistake.
That's a good philosophy, and definitely a philosophy that we here agree with. Now, would you say that media tends to help or hurt police investigations more?
Well, I think if you utilize the media, it absolutely helps. However, if you're in competition with the media, then it's viewed as a hindrance and always, you know, somebody trying to one-up you. But again, one of the things, you're doing a business, right? And your business is getting people to watch your show. My business as the police chief is to solve this crime. Now, we can come together on that if I give you the information and you go, otherwise you're going to go find someone else to talk to. I'd much rather have you talk to me and get accurate information as opposed to anyone on the street who's willing to talk to you, because I won't.
Now, our jumping off point tonight is the Gabby Petito case. What do you make of the Petito case? Why do you think it has stayed in the news cycle for so long? And how does its coverage in the media, through social media, the public communication, affect the police work?
Well, what I don't think a lot of the public recognizes is every single social media post, every single phone call that comes into the police department, someone has to be assigned to follow up on that, because there is the chance that that might be accurate information. And so nothing can go disregarded. So in this day and age where you're watching the flow of social media as a police department, you have to constantly say, what about this? We got to go look at this. And so it can grow exponentially as far as the leads that you potentially have in a case. In this particular circumstance, I think, because I know where we're going from here, having listened to Marcos, right? I think we need to be careful, because everybody absolutely deserves, as a victim, to have their information put out there. And we shouldn't do the comparison game, but we have to ask ourselves a question. There's absolutely inequity in the coverage that takes place.
So let's talk about that. Are there cases that police wish would get more news coverage, maybe genres of crimes or specific cases?
Well, so there again, I'll point a finger at my former profession. If there's something you want the media to know, I always found that you give them a call and you say, hey, I'd like to have this discussion. Right? I was actually accused of giving too much information to the media. But again, that is the avenue that you can get what is important to you out, as opposed to waiting for the media to come to you. I always felt like I wanted to drive the media cycle, not be driven by someone else.
What do you think about missing white woman syndrome? Do you think this is a media thing? And do police play a role by use of resources, sometimes by race or ethnicity?
Well, absolutely is it a thing. It is absolutely a real thing. And we're making the mistake again, right? I point fingers at the media and say, well, it's all your fault if you just report. And you point fingers at the police if you just give information. And then we bring the prosecutors in here and we throw some blame on them, right? Ultimately, we have the same goal or intention. How can we recognize that this is a thing, right? This has to be all of us agreeing, yep, this is a problem. And then we work to change that circumstance. And yes, some cases have, as Marcos described, a little more intrigue and flair. But traditionally, as we look at these cases, especially historically, right, it is the cases of young white women when the public, right, the majority of your viewing audience looks and says, that could happen to me. Then it becomes interesting to me. If I can drive down the street or absorb my news and say, it's the black people. Oh, it's the people who live in that neighborhood. Oh, it's the people buying drugs that get into trouble. But this is not unlike mass shootings, right? When it can occur in a school, my children might go to that school. Hey, wait a minute, this is a serious thing. Right? Every day in this country, people go missing. Every day, people lose their lives to violence. And we are indifferent to that total. That is a condemnation on society, right? No one of these cases is more important. We need to broaden our look and reach and say all of these are important, and we should not be satisfied until nobody goes missing or nobody loses their life.
Well, in that case, Chris, and we have about 30 seconds left, what would you like to see change with media coverage when it comes to crime?
Well, I think most importantly that it becomes more of a cooperative effort. And I'm not pointing my finger at you and your profession any more than I am at my former profession. Somehow we need to get to the point where we share the information openly. It's not a game of hide and seek or hide the ball from one or the other. Right? Here's all the information. How are we now going to work to reach justice or satisfaction for a victim or their family members? That is the most important thing.
You've been hearing from Chris Burbank, Vice President of Law Enforcement Strategy for the Center for Policing Equity. And Chris, thank you so much for your perspective on this topic. We enjoyed hearing from you.
Rosie, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us. us for our third and final In Focus discussion on crime and the media. Rounding out our conversation tonight with the victim's perspective is Brandon Merrill, Executive Director of Utah Homicide Survivors. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us tonight and welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Brandon, when media outlets receive reports about a crime, sometimes we reach out to family members or friends of the victim. But can you talk about the tricky line that they have to walk when it comes to speaking to media?
Yeah, so quite a few times the prosecutors don't want the family to speak to the media, and that's because and the police as well. And that's because it's an active, ongoing investigation. They don't want the family or friends to reveal something that could hinder that investigation or hinder the prosecution of the individual that is being accused of causing the crime. Additionally, the other issues that can arise are that sometimes the friends or family are giving inaccurate information, or they are not actually as close as they say they are. And so that sometimes can upset the family that is not wanting their case to be a part of the coverage. Sometimes they want more coverage, sometimes they don't.
Very interesting, and I definitely resonate with what you say, because sometimes when there is an inaccurate fact or misinformation, sometimes people take it as fact, and that kind of misleads like the public perception of a certain case. Now, the Gabby Petito case is the jumping off point for this conversation. What are your thoughts about how it's unfolded in the public eye?
I think that in this day and age of true crime bonanza, if I could call it that, where everybody all of a sudden becomes a true crime expert, it is more harmful than good. We have people scouring things and making wild accusations or theories about what has happened in the case, and they're also calling in police reports and tips when they weren't directly connected. Things like, oh, I saw this on the Instagram account. Police have already looked at that stuff. Or they are going to the family or friends of the victim or the the accused perpetrator, and harassing family or other people that are there. And that can also be harmful, because all it does is create this division and creates, I would think, more controversy over what is actually happening, and it makes people not want to talk to the media or the police because they're afraid that they're going to be shined on in a bad light.
It's so interesting how these true crime, right, aficionados, they get so passionate about some of these stories, following its every move. It's really an interesting phenomenon that we've seen develop over the years with the growth of social media. Now, stories like the Petito case, they can shine a light on other issues like domestic violence or intimate partner violence. What are your thoughts on this?
I think overall that's actually a positive of what is happening when the media reports on these cases so often. They want to keep this story in the public eye because it is getting more people to their station, but it also allows them to bring up important topics that aren't often brought about or that aren't comfortably brought about. And so having those conversations can help. It can help people escape, but it can also help people reach out to others that they might know experiencing this type of thing.
Now, I've asked the previous two guests this question. We want to hear from you as well. What do you think about missing white woman syndrome? Do you see any discrepancy in the types of cases that get reported or even get ongoing coverage?
I do, and I think it is a real thing. I don't know that the Petito case particularly is a result of this missing white woman syndrome, but I do see that in our cases. We have a lot of families that come to us whose cases have gone unsolved without any media attention very quickly, and it is potentially because of that discrepancy in reporting. As Gabby Petito's father said, he is hoping that media will bring attention not just to the missing white women, but to all missing persons, because it is something that each family wants their story told, especially when these cases go cold. They want something out there because it makes them feel like people are still trying to help or look for what caused this person's death or to go missing.
Brandon, we have time for final thoughts. What would you like to see changed or worked on when it comes to news coverage of crime stories?
I would like to see trauma-informed reporting. where the media is aware of the trauma that the family can experience as a result of the reporting, but also the general public, because it is a big issue. People commenting or doing their own investigations on social media or other avenues, and it is hurtful and harmful to the families, and it can be really traumatic, especially ones where young children are the surviving victims. They will eventually, the internet is forever, and they will eventually see the hurtful or harmful things that were said about their parents, especially if their parent was killed.
You bring up great points. When it comes to news reporting, every single thing, the way it's reported, right, on what platforms, it affects people in the long term, and we often don't get to see what happens, right, to these victims, their families, their loved ones, right, after that news coverage is even over. You've been hearing from Brandon Merrill, Executive Director of Utah Homicide Survivors. And Brandon, thank you for joining us tonight to provide your perspective on this conversation.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for ABC's coverage.
Thank you. And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by searching for ABC4 In Focus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.